Okay, folks, let's get started today. Um, just to let you know what our where we are in the Kuzari for today. We are on page 374 and 375 in the Kuzari. That is Ma'amar Gimel. That is the third essay out of the five. We are in paragraph or section 65 and subparagraphs 11 and 12 for today. We spoke a little bit about the generation of Rebbe Akiva, how it represents a transitional generation between those who lived during the Second Temple period and those who live in the post-Temple period, and how crucial it was to preserve Masorah during that very tumultuous time. And now Rebbe Yehuda Halevi wishes to highlight a specific episode in the life of Rebbe Akiva. And that is, there are many things that we could say about Rebbe Akiva, the way he lived his life, how he became a Baal Tshuva at the age of 40 and became only embarked on his career of scholarship at a later age, at a more advanced age in his life. He had amassed 24,000 students, or some say 24,000 pairs of students, 48,000 students. And really just a number of remarkable things about his knowledge, his scholarship, his commitment. We could talk about his relationship with his wife and how he was prepared to sacrifice so much of his personal life in order to study Torah for years on end, being away from his wife and his family. There's so much that we could discuss. Aviva tells me that the sound is chopping. I hope that it gets better over the course of this broadcast. Please let me know if it continues to be problematic. I appreciate it. We could also talk about Rebbe Akiva's demise, how he died al Kiddush Hashem and was tortured by the Romans at the end of his life, and how he recited Shema, was one of the 10 martyrs. Okay, but we're going to be focusing, Rebbe Yehuda Halevi chooses to focus on what he views as the most important segment of Rebbe Akiva's life in order to underscore what he is trying to get across, which is the integrity of the Masoretic system. And again, that's really why Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is doing a very brief overview of the rabbinic Jewish history spanning from the Second Temple period through the period of the Mishnah and the Gemara, the first few centuries of the Common Era. And the reason why he's doing that is because he wishes to demonstrate to the Karaites, who are critical of rabbinic Judaism, that the system indeed has integrity and that it has faithfully preserved our tradition, and the law has been successfully transmitted from generation to generation. In order to do that, one of the ways where he effectively does that is he demonstrates that the sages who were in leadership positions and were vested with the responsibility of perpetuating our tradition had near prophetic levels of greatness. And because of that, even though prophecy ceased with the advent of the beginning of the Second Temple several hundred years before, but there were many great rabbinic leaders who had near prophetic levels, and because of that, they had insights into reality that an average person could not have. They weren't prophets, but they were near prophets, and therefore their transmission should be trusted. And the story that's contained in the Talmud that shows us best how Rebbe Akiva had such a lofty connection with the heavenly realm is the story from Tractate Chagiga, page 14b, which is known as the Arba'a Shenichnasu LaPardes, the 4 sages of Rebbe Akiva's lifetime who entered into the Pardes. And so in order for us to really understand the story carefully, at least in the way that Rebbe Yehuda Halevi wishes for us to understand it, let's take a look at the story. Tanu Rabbanan, and here you have it on your screen. Arba'a nichnasu bapardes. there were four who entered into the Pardes. Uh, the word Pardes literally means the orchard or the garden, some translate it. And that is, they dealt with the loftiest secrets of the Torah. That's the Sepharia translation. Rashi tells us simply, Alu l'rakia al yedei Shem. They ascended to heaven using one of the divine incantational names of God. So there is two ways to understand this Talmudic passage. Either it means that they had, through some mystical, supernatural experience, an out-of-body experience of going up to the heavenly realm, or they, as Maimonides explains it, they delved into the loftiest secrets of the Torah, and he deals with on a more rational level, that they engaged in different kinds of philosophical or Kabbalistic speculation, but on the deepest level possible for the human mind to process. And these four rabbis who did this are as follows. They are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, which means the other, which is a name that Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya acquired because you'll see in a moment he heresied and he became like another person. And the fourth rabbi was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the senior among them, said to them, when upon your arrival in the upper worlds, you reach pure marble stones, al tomru mayim mayim, do not say water, water, because although they appear to be water, they are really marble. And the reason why you have to be careful about what you say when you go up to the heavenly realm is because it is stated, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before my eyes. If you speak falsehood in the heavenly realm, God will reject you and kick you out, and you will suffer great consequences for having spoken a mistruth. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time, I'm not sure if it'll be today or maybe next week, trying to explain what this issue about water versus marble is all about and why it really penetrates to the very essence of trying to understand what reality is, what our world is, what our world and our purpose is all about. But before we get there, I just want to, first of all, read some of the text from the Kuzari, and then try to explain why this narrative is such a vital narrative for understanding the life of Rabbi Akiva and what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is trying to convey through it. So let's take a look inside on page 374. It says Rabbi Akiva, the third line of subparagraph 11 says, Rabbi Akiva reached the boundaries of prophecy to the point where he was able to utilize the spiritual realms. Thus it says of him, four entered the heavenly garden, one looked and died, one looked and was injured, one looked and became a heretic, and one came in peace and left in peace. And who was that? That person who came in peace and left in peace, out of the four, only one of them was able to leave in peace, and that was Rabbi Akiva. The one who died could not endure the spectacle of the spiritual realm, and so his soul departed. This is stated about Ben Azai. Ben Azai was known for his great piety, and once he reached the heavenly realm, the way that some of the commentaries explain is that he was so betrothed to God, he was so attached to the Ribono Shel Olam, that once he had this out-of-body experience, his soul became so attached to the heavenly realm that it refused to go back into his body, and therefore his body eventually died. The second one, whose name is Ben Zoma, was injured, meaning he went insane by God's hand, and no one was able to help him. And this refers to Ben Zoma. Now, Ben Zoma was a very wise man. And the way that some of the commentaries explain it, especially Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed, explains that there are certain things that the intellect simply cannot process. You can go into intellectual overload, and that's what happened to Ben Zoma. And it is perhaps specifically because Ben Zoma's almost exclusive approach to Torah study was through the intellect, that when he reached a level that the intellect, the human intellect, could no longer process. It's almost it fried his brain, so to speak, and he could not process this anymore, and he went insane. He went into intellectual overload. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later when we read a little bit about Ben Zoma. The third one, who is Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, abandoned all religious observances. Having viewed the spiritual realm, he said, the commandments are but means to reach the spiritual level, and I have already reached it. Therefore, I will not heed the Torah's commandments. He was lost, and he caused others to be lost. He went astray and led others astray. Now, it's altogether possible that what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is doing is making a critical reference to some of his sectarian colleagues, or his co-religionists, the Karaites, because perhaps their argument is the same as the argument of Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya. They look at the Torah and say that all you need to do is just the outlines of the law, because as long as God sees that you are pure of heart and that you have reached a certain spiritual level, you no longer need to engage with the minutia of observance. And that was really where Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya got it wrong. Now, Elisha ben Avuya is really the archetype of all the tragic heroes who fall from grace and fall into darkness. Elisha ben Avuya is the classical, I'm sure in Greek tragedy you have this a lot, that he's the classical Darth Vader of Jewish literature. He was the greatest hope for the Jewish people, Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, because he was so brilliant and so pious, and he had alamilas. And because of this experience where he reached too far and reached too high, he had this fall and eventually went to the deepest depths of evil. There is, and I think we've quoted this book before in a class several months or years ago, I don't remember anymore, but there's a great book that it gives a novelized version of the whole story about Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya called As a Driven Leaf. It was written in the 1940s by Milton Steinberg. It's one of those few books that whenever I've read it, certain passages still make me cry, which is unusual for a book. If you haven't ever read it, I really recommend it. It was written very, very beautifully, very poignant writing. And even though the author takes certain liberties in filling in blanks in the story that probably never happened, but nonetheless, it really brings the story of these four rabbis who entered into the Pardes into a very, very vivid narrative. And Steinberg certainly takes the Maimonidean approach, that there was nothing mystical about this speculation, unlike Rashi, right? But rather that it was really four rabbis who decided to delve into the deepest depths of introspection and speculation about the heavenly realm. And as a result, many of them, 3 out of the 4 of them, were damaged in the process, and only one of them, Rabbi Akiva, was able to emerge and come out of it safely in the same way that he had entered in. Okay. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda Levi's next paragraph, in paragraph 12, he writes, but Rabbi Akiva was able to utilize both worlds without coming to harm. It was said about him that he was worthy of having the divine presence rest upon him, but his era was not worthy of it. And this is brought in a medrash. He was one of the 10 martyrs. And we'll get to the martyrdom story later on. But we'll hold it here in the text of the Kuzari. And let me just delve it a little bit more into this story. In order for us to appreciate how Rashi understands what was going on in this story, which seems to be the way that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who is also part of the mystical school of Judaism, understands the story, because he talks about it as a near prophetic experience. There is a tshuva from Rav Hai Gaon, who was a Gaon is someone who lives in the anywhere from like the 8th to 10th century. This was a period of Jewish history where the rabbinic academies in the Middle East were ruled over by Roshei Yeshiva, who were called the Gaonim. And there's a unique style of writing, which is not as prolific as the later medieval period, but is very different from the style of writing of the Talmud. It's post-Talmudic, but pre-medieval in that sense. I mean, when I say medieval, the medieval period has can be defined in many different ways, depending upon the historical context. But what I mean to say is that the period of the Rishonim, that we call the medievalists, really begins at around the 10th century, or 10th or 11th century. And the Gaonim are right before that period of time. And so Rav Hai Gaon writes something very interesting in a responsum to explain this whole story. And he too wishes to impress upon us the lofty level of many of the sages that are described in the Mishnah and the Talmud. He says, V'shema ata yodeya, ki harbe min hachachamim hayu sovrim, that many of our sages were of the opinion, ki mishuhu hagun bekama midot zechurot u'mevu'arot, that that anyone who was a well-refined person, having proper character traits, כשמבקש לצפות במרכבה ולהציץ בהיכלות של מלאכי מרום, that when such a person would wish to get a glimpse of the heavenly chariot. Now, what he means by the heavenly chariot is a reference to a Mishnah in Tractate Chagiga, which says that a discussion of the heavenly chariot is one of the most esoteric subjects in all of Judaism, and therefore it should only be taught to an individual student and should not be proliferated to multiple students because it's very subject to misinterpretation and misunderstanding. So when an individual who has reached a certain level of refinement wishes to gaze upon and to speculate and to contemplate the Merkava, the divine chariot. And the reason why it's called the chariot is because there's a vision that the prophet Ezekiel has in the first chapter of Ezekiel, and it appears in a few other places in Nach, where God is described as residing on a chariot. So it actually is a very, very lofty kind of speculation. And it involves, at least according to Rav Hai Gaon and Rashi, having an out-of-body experience where your neshama is able to temporarily leave your body and ascend to different chambers of heaven and be witness to various different kinds of heavenly realms. So when you want to gaze upon the chariot, when you want to look upon the different chambers of the angels of up high, yeshlo derachim la'asot. There are very specific methods in learning how to do that. Sheyeshev b'ta'anit yamim yeduim. So, by the way, before I explain to you how the traditional method that Rav Hai Gaon suggests, let me also point out that this is very popular now. People are using peyote, and people are using mushrooms and other kinds of pharmaceuticals because they want to have these mind-expanding experiences. I'm not advocating that in any way. I don't think that would be a responsible thing to do. However, this is not the point that I'm trying to make is that this endeavor to try and expand beyond the physical realm and to be able to get a glimpse of other dimensions of reality is something that has been going on for time immemorial. And so in Judaism, only really select people were considered qualified to do this. And the way that you would start off is you would fast for several days that would be specified by your mentor. Umeniach rosho bein birkav. You would then place your head between your knees to sort of squash yourself or minimize yourself to the best of your ability. Like imagine a person sitting on the floor with their head between their knees, completely involved in a meditative experience. V'lochesh la'aretz shirot v'tishbachot harbe shehin mefurashot, and then to engage in certain incantations which you are taught. And these incantations that involve making mention of praises of different names of God were considered to have a certain kind of positive effect in allowing you to have this out-of-body experience. Uvechein meitzitz bapinimim uvachadarim kimishu roa be'inav. And through this process, you would, if you did it correctly, you would succeed in being able to have some kind of mental image of different chambers of other dimensions. And you would be able, as if you were seeing it with your own eyes, physically, you would be able to see Hechalot Shiva, 7 different levels of heaven, V'tzofeh ki'ilu hu nichnas mehechal lehechal, v'ro'eh ma sheyesh bo. And you would then gaze within each heavenly chamber, each heavenly level, and go from one level of heaven to the next and see what was contained within each and every level. B'yesh, and so Rav Hai Gaon says, lest you think that this is not something that's ever been documented, this is carefully documented in rabbinic literature. Now, this is not something that a lot of people are familiar with, and that's why I just want to sort of present it to you in its most elementary form, which is this responsum from Rav Hai Gaon. He says, V'yesh shtei mishnayot shehatanaim shonim oto b'davar zeh. He says there are 2 literary texts or bodies where our rabbinic sages from the time of the Mishnah describe their experience, their out-of-body experience, and they actually document what they have witnessed in each level of heaven that they were able to traverse. B'nikrot hechalot rabati, v'hechalot zutrati. And they are known respectively as the large volume of hechalot experiences and the small volume of hechalot experiences. And the word hechalot simply means levels or chambers of heaven. That's what the word hechalot means. Now, the davar zeh mefursam v'yadua. This is well known. It is public knowledge, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, says Rav Hai Gaon. And we have today extant a huge corpus of literature called Pirkei Hechalot, the chapters of the heavenly realms. Okay? And I just wanted to let you know that lest you think that this is not something that's studied, it may not be something that you'll find being studied in a classical yeshiva. But these are midrashim, and they have been collected, and they've even been annotated. They have been studied in scholarly form in universities. There's actually a non-Jewish, a German professor who has become the world-renowned expert in Hechalot literature. His name is Peter Schaefer. And he did a wonderful project back in, I think, the 80s. And he took all of the different fragments of Hechalot literature that were found in the Cairo Geniza, and he assembled them all of the different fragments and the different versions, and he actually collected them in several volumes. So there's a huge amount of literature, but even before Schaefer's work, you had, Midrashim by Eisenstein, done in the early 20th century, which also is a compendium of various more esoteric midrashim, and he collected all of the Hechalot literature. So it's widely available. And essentially what these texts do is it discusses, usually the main protagonists of these texts are Rebbe Akiva, Rebbe Yishmael appears in them, Rebbe Nechunya ben Hakana occasionally appears in these kinds of texts. And it basically says, it's written many times in first person, and it says, Rebbe Akiva said that when I entered into the first chamber, I saw these kinds of angels. When I ascended into the next chamber, I went and I saw this kind of thing. And the people, the rabbis, who are the ones who actually do this ascension, are known as the Yordei Merkava, those who go down into the chariot. And why they're called going down instead of going up is a whole discussion. I'm not going to get into that now. But this is a very important corpus of literature that is authentic, that is ascribed to the rabbis of the Mishnah. And even though it's not, part of the more famous midrashic bodies of literature like Medrash Rabbah or Yalkut Shimoni, but it is authentic midrash. And so Rav Haigon continues and he says, Ba'al otan tzifiyot shana tanazeh arba'a nichnasu b'pardes. He says, now, while the Talmud does not contain extensive quotes from Hechalot literature, but we do get this small snippet in the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga that we just studied about the 4 sages who entered into the Pardes. Himshil et ha'hechalot halalu lepardes ve'e'ela lahem Hashem hazeh. And so the author in the Talmud is basically doing a fusion. He's taking a very small piece of a small text and packing in a huge amount of information about what it was like for these rabbis to go and have this ascension to go through the various chambers of heaven. Instead of calling them Hechalot, in our Talmudic passage, he calls it the Pardes, the orchard. B'dima et ha'arba halalu shehu sover ki heitzitzu b'merkava v'ra'u shenichnasu lahechalot kemo shenichnas lapardes. And the reason why he writes that these 4 sages entered into the orchard instead of going into the Hechalot, into the heavenly chambers, is because he wishes to impress upon us that their vision that they had when they engaged in this speculation experience, this out-of-body experience, was as vivid for them as it would be for someone who was walking through a physical orchard and admiring all of the different trees and all of the different plant life and flora that he would observe when he was walking through an orchard. In that way, there was that same vividness when these rabbis had this out-of-body experience going through the different chambers of heaven. V'davar zeh barur mimekamo techila, ki piska de matmitin she'aleh nishneit mishnah zu v'lo b'merkava b'yachid. He says, and it's clear that this is the correct interpretation because this Talmudic passage is an addendum to the Mishnah in Chagiga that talks about how one has to be very careful about studying matters of the Merkava, about the divine chariot. Ela im kein haya chacham umevin mida'ato. That one should never share information about the heavenly chariot unless the student is already reached the level of wisdom and knows a tremendous amount on his own before he is given over this very esoteric information. And furthermore, just to demonstrate that we're dealing with this very mystical ascension experience, is that note that Rabbi Akiva said to the other 3, Kisha'atem magi'in eitzel avnei shayish tahor, al tomru mayim mayim. He said to them, Chevra, when you get to the very pure marble stones in heaven, do not say water, water. And he says, where else do we find this kind of language? He says this is a direct quote from Echalot Zutrati, which is one of that smaller volume of ascension literature. Furash Belashon Hazeh, Patach Echal Shishi, Nir'eh Kemi Sheyesh Bo Meya Alafim Revavot Galei Mayim. That it says over there that he opened up the 6th chamber of heaven, that he went into the 6th chamber, and it appeared in this 6th level or 6th chamber of heaven that there were Meya Alafim Revavot, hundreds of thousands and myriads of waves of water that were rushing through in this chamber of heaven. But in reality, the Einbo Afilu Tipa Echat Shel Mayim, but in reality, there was not even a drop of water in this heavenly chamber. Ela avir ziv avne shayish tahor chalulot keichal sheziv marehen dome lamayim. But rather it was marble stones that were hollow and with a very, very clarified kind of air, and that had a radiance to it. And when you see marble stones that are very radiant, sometimes you have the optical illusion of moving water. And that's really basically, so Rav Hai Gaon says, you clearly see that this imagery that is being described in our Talmudic passage is identical to the Echalot depiction of one of the sages going up into one of the heavenly chambers. And he says, V'zeh sheshanu ben Azai heitzitz v'meit, ki higia zmano lihipater min ha'olam. Now, as far as why did Ben Azai, when he had this esoteric out-of-body experience, why did he die? So Rav Hai Gaon says it was his time to go. It wasn't because Ben Azai was inferior in any way, but rather because it was his time. Now, I don't know why he says that. Perhaps it's because he regards Ben Azai as being so holy and pure, he doesn't wish to impugn upon him any kind of deficiency that caused him to die when he had this experience. But then he says, "Shoshanu ben Zoma heitzitz v'nifga, pitaron nifga kamo shenishtatem min hamarot hamavhilot shelo echila da'ato l'sovlam." He says, why did Ben Zoma go insane? Is because the images that he gazed upon were so frightening and so overwhelming that his intellect could not tolerate them. The domele pigaim diamrina nezehu shir shel pigaim yoshev b'seiter elyon. He quotes a Gemara that tends to tell us, that seems to be telling us the same idea, that sometimes a person can engage in speculative ideas that can drive him insane. And we're going to get to the next passage in Tractate Chagiga shortly, where we're going to talk a little bit more about Ben Zoma. I think I'm going to leave it over here. I think what I've presented to you is that there is definitely a view that this is an out-of-body experience, and that's why I believe that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is really emphasizing this story as part of Rabbi Akiva's life, is that Rabbi Akiva reaches the boundaries of prophecy. That's the way he describes it. And for Rabbi Akiva, the prophetic experience is a product of piety, of righteousness, and being able to transcend the physical realm. Very different from the Rambam, from Maimonides, who views the prophetic experience as a very high intellectual achievement, but really does not have to do with mysticism as much. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and as you see from Rashi and Rav Hai Gaon, really view this as having an out-of-body experience, getting in touch with a reality that far transcends our world. And the reason why this needs to be impressed upon us, I believe, in the Kuzari, is to try and remind us that there was much more than meets the eye to these rabbis. They were giants when it came to understanding the truths of not only Torah, but all of reality itself. And as a result, you cannot discard them and dismiss them lightly as the Karaites have done. Okay, questions, comments? Would anyone like to comment on this at all? How's the sound quality? Is everything coming across okay? All right, good. So if you're okay with this, there's certain parts of this story that I would like to continue with you, but it would take us another probably to the top of the hour if we were to expand on it. I do want to discuss with you this issue about the difference between marble and water. I will get to that, God willing, next week when we continue this discussion. I believe it really speaks to one of the most fundamental issues that Judaism addresses, which is free will versus determinism and how a human being is supposed to view the world. Okay, and so we'll get to that shortly. It'll be a little bit off-road because it's not Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's main issue, but I just want to mention that to you next week. So we'll do that next time. Let me shift gears and let's talk about Parshas Toldos, this weekly Parsha. Let's get started. Again, if anyone would like to interject on the discussion of Rabbi Akiva, now would be the right time.
The Kuzari, what's his point in telling us about this?
Right. So as I mentioned, right, Rabbi Akiva is the highest level of non-prophetic human being. Prophecy is ended, but if you want to talk about how lofty and holy this human being is, don't do what the Karaites did and dismiss Rabbi Akiva and say that he made this stuff up. This is a human being who has reached the apex of human understanding of reality. So don't think that he's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. He has reached near prophetic levels. It's a polemic against the Karaites. That's the objective. Okay, as has been all of the pages that we have learned over the last several months. Okay. Okay, let's continue with the Parsha. The Torah tells us, "Vaye'ehav Yitzchak et Esav ki tzayid b'fiv." We know from the story that we've learned many times that Yitzchak loved Esav and Rivka loved Yaakov. I'm assuming as parents, they both loved both children. What the Torah is trying to point out to us is that Yitzchak had a special affinity for Esav, Rivka had a special affinity for Yaakov. But the reason that's given as to why Yitzchak loved Esav, had this preferential love for Esav, is kitzayid b'fiv, is that he was a hunter for his mouth. And the simple understanding for that is that Esav was a hunter, and he would regularly trap or kill animals that he would then prepare venison for his father, and Esav was known, and the Talmud plays this up, for his great kibud avayim, for the great honor that he showed to his father. He had a great love and a great closeness with his father, would always bring his father gifts of things that he had hunted in the field, and Yitzchak therefore had a special love for him. Yaakov was perhaps more detached from his father, but perhaps was closer with his mother. And so you see this dichotomy forming, and the question now becomes, what is the deeper meaning of this pasuk? So the Shemi Shmuel, who is Rabbi Shmuel Borstein of Sachachav, who lives into the 20th century, is a source, a Hasidic text that we have quoted many times, because although it's a Hasidic text, it takes a very rational, intellectual approach to trying to teach us deeper lessons of the Psukim. And he's known in some circles as the Hasidic Maharal, as, again, taking this very philosophical approach, but using still a Hasidic approach of trying to find the deeper meaning of the text. So let's take a look what he says. First, the Shemi Shmuel quotes Rashi. He says, "Hineba pasuk ba'yi esav ish yodei tzayid pirish Rashi latzud ularamot et aviv b'fiv." That Rashi tells us that there's a midrashic interpretation of what it means that Esav was tzayid b'fiv, not that he caught or trapped animals for his father's mouth, but rather that the word piv, his mouth, refers to Esav's mouth, and that Esav would entrap his father using the words of his mouth, and that Esav was a big talker, and he would say things that he knew would be impressive to his father. And that's the deeper meaning of what this verse means. Yaakov did not have any pretenses or airs about him, but Esav would talk the talk, and his father was very impressed because of that. V'sha'alo. And now Rashi gives us an example of what Esav would say to impress his father. He would say, Abba, heich ma'asrin et hamelach ve'et hatevn. He would say, Father, how do we tithe salt? How do we tithe straw? Okay, now, a We know that there's a law in Judaism that when you have agricultural harvest, you're supposed to tithe it. You give a portion of it to the Kohen, a portion of it to the Levi, a portion of it to the poor, right? So we all know that. But the only thing that needs to be tithed is actual fruits and vegetables. Now, is salt a fruit or a vegetable? No, salt is a mineral, and therefore salt is not subject to agricultural tithing. You don't have to give a portion of your salt to anyone else in the community if you mine salt or get it from the sea. Straw is a very similar idea. Straw is the byproduct of wheat, and you only have to tithe your wheat. You don't actually have to tithe the straw that you use, let's say, either as thatching material for your roof or to feed it to your animals. It's not subject to tithing, okay? And this was what Esav used to do, is that he would ask his father these kinds of questions, Kesavur aviv shuhu medakdek b'mitzvot. And this would impress upon Yitzchak that Esav wanted to go above and beyond the letter of the law. Meaning, I know, Father, that I'm not obligated to tithe these things, but if I want to tithe them, show me how to do it. And that's sort of, letting someone know, signaling to someone that you're really, really pious. Okay? So it's almost, like going over to someone and saying, nice to see you at the grocery. I'm only going to purchase that kind of meat or that kind of milk because I am very meticulous in the food that I serve in my home. Why did you have to make a point of saying that? You want to demonstrate that you go above and beyond the minimal requirements of kashrut. And that's what Esav would typically do to his father, not because he really meant it, but rather because he wanted to show to his father that he was an uber pious mensch. Okay? Now, ulahavin. So that's the end of the medrash. And now the question that the Rav Borstein wants to ask is as follows. Lama lo sha'alo dikduke mitzvot acherim kagon shchita uchedoime sheyesh bahem dikduke mitzvot be'emet. When Esav is being portrayed by the Midrash as asking his father, issues of minutia of religious practice, why does it depict Esav as asking specifically these questions? How do you tithe salt and how do you tithe straw? He says, why not give other examples of where Esav could have shown off his piety by asking his father, how do we slaughter an animal properly? Why did Esav choose an example which actually is a type of act which is unnecessary according to halacha? Wouldn't it have been better for Esav to ask his father a question of tithing or doing some kind of ritual that is actually required by halacha, instead of asking his father a question that is not even required by halacha? So again, why does the Midrash use this specific example? What is the deeper meaning behind this Midrash? And really what we're going to try to do is to try and analyze the message of the Medrash, not so much the message of the Pasuk, but rather what the Medrash is pulling out of this Pasuk and what the deeper message is. He says, V'nir'eh, and it would seem to me, he says, Tihine kol seder habriya haya b'matchonet shel tafel v'ikar. He says, when you consider the makeup of all of this world and everything that's in it, all of reality, you will note that this world is comprised of primary and secondary things in the world. That's many things in this world are considered the primary objective, and many things are ancillary to that primary objective. All you have to do, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes mention of this many times in the Kuzari, is look at a tree. If I was to ask you, you're going to an orchard and you're going to an apple orchard or an orange orchard, what is the primary objective of that orchard? Well, it's the fruit. But in order to gain that fruit, you have to grow trees. And trees are comprised of roots and a trunk and bark and leaves and branches and foliage and all of those other things. But if we were to philosophize about the function of the tree, we would say that the leaves of the tree are ancillary to its fruit. So this world is comprised of so many different layers of primary, secondary, tertiary, etc., etc.
And all the skirts that I want to take, maybe one or two more skirts. That's it.
Going to just to everyone. Okay. All right. So anyway, just wanted to. There we go. So just wanted to make a point of that's what our world is made of. It's made up of things that are primary, things that are not primary. And he says an example of this is Sha'olam haba ikar, va'olam hazeh tafel. Okay, so let's think about it in the largest scale possible. Olam haba, the next world, that's the primary function. And God brings us into this world first so that we can get into Olam haba. That's why the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says that this world is like a corridor to the grand ballroom that is waiting for us at the end of the corridor. So the corridor is ancillary to the main ballroom, as we all understand, right? Another example of primary and secondary is the 6 days of the week. Time has there's primary time and there's ancillary time. So the 6 work days are ancillary to the Shabbos. Okay, we appreciate the idea. Similarly, you have fruit. You have some fruit which is, an orange or an apple. The peel of the orange is ancillary to the fruit of the orange, okay? And the pits of the apple are ancillary to the fruit of the apple. B'chol adam im oset ha'pu'ula asher nivra lema'anahu konesh shleimut. He says every human being acquires perfection by fulfilling the task for which he and she was brought into this world. V'im hatafel hu tafel be'emet li'ikar, harei be'emtsa'uto na'aseh gam hatafel shalem. And if a person prioritizes life by making the primary goals of his life primary and the secondary goals of his life secondary, then even the secondary issues of his life have helped him reach perfection. So, for example, maybe I'm meant to be a great author, okay? And maybe my primary contribution in life is supposed to write, the great Canadian novel, let's say, okay? And it's going to inspire and profoundly touch millions and millions of people. But there's so much more about me. I may be a mother, and I may be a sibling, and I may be a daughter, and all of the other things for which I've been brought into this world. But that may not be my primary objective. But if I set out to fulfill my primary objective, and at the same time, I enrich myself and others with my secondary objectives of all the relationships that I have been blessed with, so then I have lived my life with purpose and have made even the secondary objectives of my life, I've put them in proper perspective, and I've lived a full life, and I've lived my life to perfection. The thing that goes wrong, however, is that when I make the secondary primary and the primary secondary, that's where he's leading. He says, "V'im ha'olam hazeh tafel be'emet la'olam haba, u'mitkayem hatkein atzmacha beprosdor, chulei, nit'aleh gam olam hazeh u'mitkadesh." He says, another example of this would be, is if I properly prioritize my spiritual well-being over my physical well-being. And so therefore I truly make the pleasures of this world secondary to the pleasures of the next world, the spiritual enhancements of what my life is supposed to be focused on. And I make this world a corridor, a means to get to the next world, to reach spiritual perfection. So then even the pleasures of this world are elevated because I've used them and I've approached them with the proper perspective and the proper attitude. Va'olam haba meir gam b'olam hazeh, v'kuyam olamcha tir'eh b'chayecha. And that's how a person lives a very fulfilling life, even in this secondary existence, this physical existence, because he or she recognizes that everything in this world is merely a vehicle to bring me to the spiritual perfection of the next realm. And if you have that attitude, then every moment in this world is also very fulfilling, even though you acknowledge it's not the main show. V'chein sheishet yimei ha'ma'aseh, im heim tfeilim l'shabbat be'emet, harei be'emtzaut Shabbat gam sheishet yimei ha'ma'aseh mitkanim u'mit'alim. He says, time is the same thing. If I use my time effectively and I make my primary objective, the sweetest times of my week are the Sabbath, and everything that I do is focused on having that spiritual experience on Shabbat, and I do that even during the 6 days of my week, and I recognize that a Tuesday is great, but it's not as special as Shabbos. But I do things on Tuesday in order to prepare for Shabbos. I'll study a little Parsha, and I'll become enriched so that when Shabbos comes around, I'll be able to share Divrei Torah with my family and have the spiritual enriching experience. Then even my Tuesdays are elevated because I've put everything in its proper perspective. V'zehu sheramzu chazal shebechol yom ochel lechavod or achol lechavod Shabbat. V'hainu she'ashabbat he'ira l'sheishet yimei ha'ma'aseh. That the sages tell us that if you find a good food during the week, you should save it for Shabbat. In other words, what you do during the week, if it's focused for the Sabbath, you've elevated the days of the week as well. And he says, and this is true about fruit. If the peel of the fruit sort of acts in the way that it's supposed to as a protectant for the fruit, then the peel itself is elevated, and this even has halachic ramifications, which I'm not going to go into now. But let's see where he's getting to. He says, "V'yesh lomar shezatzmo haya inyan b'riyat Yaakov ve'esav." He says that when we think about two siblings, Yaakov and Esav, they are brought into this world. And what he's leading up with is that this is really what I've suggested to you up until now, that sometimes you have one person is primary, one person or one thing is secondary. He says, the Esav hayatafel Yaakov. The reality is that the original intent was that Yaakov was meant to be the main progeny of Yitzchak, and Esav was supposed to be the ancillary progeny of Yitzchak. Okay? And that was always the intended roles. That not that Esav was unnecessary or superfluous, but Esav was meant to be ancillary, just like the peel of the fruit is necessary for the fruit to survive and stay fresh, but it has to know what its place is. If Esav would have known his role of being the tafel to Yaakov, the secondary to the primary Yaakov, then Esav would have reached his completion and perfection thereby. Harav HaKadosh meprashischa dema kushi al Esav shahaya rasha. The Yid of Prashischa used to ask, why are we so disturbed that Esav went off the derech and he became a bad person? He says, Hareim haya mekayem mitzvot Hashem haya gavru yoter. Shere bishvil mitzvat kibud av shekiyim anu solim kol kach ra'ot rabot v'tzarot. He says, consider that every good thing that Esav did in his lifetime has come back to haunt us. The fact that Esav does have merits means that the descendants of Esav are able to harm the Jewish people. So shouldn't we be happy that Esav did not do more good in his life? And his answer was, "Ve'amar shahaya yachol liot kamo shahaya, ele im ze lihiyot nichna liYaakov, v'hapirush bevadai hu kidvarein." And he explains that Esav could have been so much more. The and he could have done so much more good in his life if only he would have submitted himself as being ancillary to Yaakov. But that's not what Esav did. Esav could not accept the fact that he was of secondary importance to any other person, and certainly not his sibling. And therefore, he refused to submit, he refused to acknowledge this relationship. And the word Esav itself means asui. He felt that he was the primary and that Yaakov was the secondary. And this is where he gets to the punchline. And because the hour is late, let me just point out that this is the reason, says the Shem Shmuel, that our sages portray Esav as asking his father, how do you tithe salt and straw? Because the reality is, when you consider what is the primary product of growing wheat stalks in your field, is it to obtain straw? Is it to obtain bran? Or is it to obtain the kernel of wheat that is the ultimate objective? And what Esav essentially was doing is that he was trying to impress the idea that even though subconsciously, subliminally, he knew that he was the straw and not the wheat kernel, that he was the ancillary and not the primary, he insisted on tithing and placing emphasis on that which was secondary and making it primary. And it's almost as if he is subconsciously accentuating his own error by asking his father, how do we tithe straw? The proper response to that is, straw is not the final product. It's not the primary issue. It's secondary and therefore does not require tithing. You, Esav, however, view yourself as being primary instead of secondary, and that's why you wish to tithe it and place prominence upon it when that prominence is misplaced. And the same thing is true with salt. Salt is a condiment. It is meant to ameliorate and to spice and to make tasty the primary food that you're eating, whether it's a piece of meat or vegetables or whatever you're eating. And by you insisting on tithing salt, instead of acknowledging its proper role as being just an ancillary enhancer, you are demonstrating your whole mistake about what is right in this world and what is wrong. And that's the lesson that we're supposed to draw from this midrash about Esav, when it says that this is what Esav was asking. When we make that which is secondary primary, or we make that which is primary secondary, whether it's my role within a community, or whether it's my misplaced priorities of the physical over the spiritual, or whether it's my misplaced priorities over what is the main portion of my week and what should I be emphasizing in my life, then we are only repeating the same mistake that Esav made. Sometimes the decisions and the realizations that we come to in life, that it's not about me. It's really about something that's much more important than me. Sometimes that can be a very painful realization and acknowledgement, but it has to be made nonetheless. If we make ourselves primary when really we're only a small footnote or portion of the story, then we are going awry in the same way that Esav went awry, instead of acknowledging that there was something much bigger than himself that he needed to submit to. And that's, I think, the lesson for the day that I want to leave you with, is that sometimes it is about us, but most of the time it's not about us. Most of the time there's a much bigger project and a much bigger objective that stands to be gained. And as long as we know what our role is in the larger scheme of things, we can actually make an invaluable contribution and really, really perfect ourselves in the process. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, not much. It's been pretty quiet the last few weeks. We don't have Rachel, I think because she got a job. But if anyone else wants to ever...
I do have a question.
Karen, please.
I do have a question. Just like Yisachar and Zvulun had this, they worked together, right? Similarly, Yaakov and Esav could have had that kind of relationship in terms of the future of the Jewish people, which is what you're alluding to here. But how do we know that Esav should have known that he was ancillary? Is there a textual, is there somewhere that says that, okay, it's going to be, especially since he was the Bechor, right? So you think that he would he was making the wrong assumption. Is it only because he sold the Bechorah to Yaakov earlier on, or is there something else? And I'm sorry if the question might require much more than a second or two of an answer.
No, it's a very valid question. You know, a lot of times we look at our siblings and we can see the temperaments that they possess or that they don't possess. We look at ourselves, and it doesn't have to be just a sibling, it can be another human being. I can look at, for example, a rabbinic colleague of mine and say, he's the main guy, and I'm the ancillary guy, right? Because I know his skill set is far more advanced than mine is, for example, okay? And if I can help him make a contribution by, let's say, assisting him in a project, then I will be content with that because I know that he'll be able to carry it much further than I would be able to do alone. Esav should have come to the realization that the future of the Jewish people required someone of a greater sort of tranquil temperament than Esav's own restless spirit. And he should have come to the realization early on that I'm not the proper temperament to be the patriarch of the chosen people. I can certainly play a role, and I can certainly be the Zavulun to the Yisachar, right? If that's the analogy that we want to continue with. But you know, that was his choice, and he refused to acknowledge it. So I'm not sure if we can point to actual texts, but our sages certainly draw that out from the relationship between Yaakov and Esav. Okay, and maybe that's your project, Karen, is to find textual support for it.
Thank you.
All right,
Yeah.
have a great day, everybody. We'll see you soon.